So our final speaker for this session it comes to us from Arizona State University's School of Earth and Space Exploration, Gwyneth Gordon. Her paper is a blind comparison of multiple analytical methods for soil comparison in a home invasion robbery double shooting case in Urban Park, Arizona.
So I think I probably have the longest title here. And I also have to tell you I'm a little nervous because usually I'm giving 12.5-minute talks to American Geophysical Union and Geological Society of America. So your talks are longer and I don't know the audience. In retrospect, it was really naive for me to have accepted this case, and perhaps even a little arrogant to think that I could do some work on it. But I'm always enjoyed a challenge, and I've worked as, I was trained as a field geologist, and I've worked in geochemistry for over 20 years. So I do know something a little bit about soils. And I'd also like to say that this case actually really kind of spurred my interest in a lot of forensics, and I subsequently went on to take a number of forensics courses, and I now volunteer at the Mesa Police Department. And much of what I've done has given me a greater appreciation for what trace evidence analysts do. We were approached by a detective in the Phoenix Police Department. They had 2 victims were beaten and shot, and there were shoe impressions in the dirt outside of the victim's home. They had a person of interest, and when they questioned him, he was wearing boots with adhering soil, and he stated that he was gardening in his yard, but the investigators had some doubts about that, the veracity of that statement. So they came to us and said, can you guys look at soil? So I started doing a bunch of reading. I got the USGS open file report on forensic evidence. I was reading a lot of forensics books, and I looked at the open literature. And I ended up coming away a little bit confused. I knew that Munsell color tests and sorting and size and possibly X-ray diffraction were some of the standard techniques. But in the last 10 years, there were a lot of articles out there about other types of techniques. And I wasn't actually sure what was the best technique to use. And our lab is fortunate enough to have a lot of analytical equipment. So I wasn't sure how to approach it, so being kind of a little bit OCD, I did them all. But also, I wasn't, in some ways, I wasn't sure that I wanted to prevent any confirmational bias. So we met with the detectives, and I outlined the sampling scheme that I wanted them to use. And then I requested that they don't tell me the identity of any of the samples. So I knew that there was a sample from the suspect's clothing. There are multiple samples from the victim's house. There are multiple samples from the suspect's house. And I also requested that they collect other neighborhood yards because I wanted to see if I was able to make a comparison, how unique would that comparison be? So that's what we did. And then they provided me 15 samples. Now, I will be the first to say that I had, in an experimental setup, I would have 15 samples and they would all have exactly the same amount of material. I had one sample that had very little material, and it was hard not to believe that that might be from the suspect's clothing, but I had no confirmation of that. And I also had no idea about the identity of the others. They were just labeled 1 to 15. So the question was the suspect's clothing sample consistent with any of these other samples, and how unique? And a little bit, I tried to think about if I was on a jury, what would I want to see? And I would say if someone came to me and said, I didn't know what any of these samples were, and these 2 I matched without knowing about them, I would find that very strong evidence. Now, I also realize that as a caseworker, this is not a practical technique. So I started out with what seemed, with the Munsell soil color tests, grain size, shape, sorting. I've had courses in polarized light microscopy, so mineral identification, and looking for any allochthonous or exotic particles. There was quite a bit of clay content, and the identification of clays under PLM is rather difficult, so I did X-ray diffraction. I also wanted to get a more quantitative definition of what the ratio of different minerals was. And then I also did elemental composition by solution ICPMS. In addition, there's some papers out of the UK that was showing carbon and nitrogen, and in particular carbon and nitrogen isotopes, as indicative of, that could be discriminatory in cases of soils. And in addition, our lab, basically I'm an isotope geochemist, so we also do a lot of radiogenic isotopes. And actually, up until yesterday afternoon, I thought you guys were all excited about the applications of strontium and lead isotopes to soil analysis. Okay, so I started out with a photomicroscopy, and there was some variation in soil and color, but it was actually not all that dramatic. In a lot of ways, I probably reinvented the wheel. But I'm in part presenting this because I think it's a useful indication that there are actually a lot of academics who are interested in working with the forensics community, but it's not always clear how to make those connections. And rather than having us try to reinvent the wheel, it would be a lot better if we could do collaborative work where some of our instrumentation and expertise can be utilized by the forensics community, and you guys can, make us understand more about what the needs of the forensics community are. So I do volunteer work, and in part it was because I knew that I was an academic, and I was not really very aware of what, I have lots of fancy tools, I can do lots of fancy analyses, but I wasn't aware what's actually really relevant and helpful. So I had to learn a lot of things that you guys already have full knowledge of: chain of custody. We had brought a safe into our lab, and we brought bicycle chains to lock up while we were doing the furnace. I was very conscientious, so I stayed with it. I package up all the samples. If I have to go to the bathroom, I take them with me. Because I just wasn't sure, and we had an open lab. There were some restrictions on who can come in, but, I wanted to be absolutely sure. So that would be something that most of you would not have to face. And I did a lot of reading, so I learned that there could be some sample bias due to collection time, and there could definitely be sample bias due to transfer, because if you're walking across a field, you're not getting the larger particles adhering to your boots for extended periods of time. In addition, there's sample heterogeneity. Soils are inherently a mixture of materials. So the particle size, and in addition, sample size. So I was always trying to preserve at least half of my sample for future analysis. So we did a lot of work to try to reduce our detection limits and reduce our required sample sizes. And as I say, preserving samples. So I got a lot of information like this. This is only a small portion of the ICPMS data, but what this basically does is it has an enrichment factor basically compared, it emphasizes the differences between these 15 soils. So I ended up with a great deal of data like that. And in all these cases, when I was doing this analysis, I didn't know which samples were which. So it made it a very large data set to work with. Subsequently, you saw that ICPMS, and it's a lot of data, and it's hard to pull out any patterns. So subsequently, when I looked at this data, I didn't have the identity of different samples. But I could see that, for instance, you can see here, just from, this is just carbon and nitrogen content, that the suspect's clothing was not all that similar to the victim's house, that there's a big range in the neighborhood yards. And I have to say that visually, there were not a great deal of differences in the mineralogy between a lot of these soils. And also, I would just like to make a plug that strontium and lead isotopes, although you guys probably will not have access to that, in collaboration with academic institutions, they can be a very powerful tool. The suspect's house samples are clustered quite closely together. This actually has Y error bars, it's just that they're a lot smaller than the symbols. Again, radiogenic isotopes for lead have a very large range within the neighborhood. But again, this is a cluster analysis. For the ICPMS data, it was not so distinctive. The suspect's house, those samples clustered fairly close together, and the victim's house closely together. For XRD and isotope data combined, the suspect's clothing was quite similar. It turned out, they only told me there was one sample. It turned out there were 2 samples from the suspect's clothing. And they seemed to be quite similar in linkage distance to the suspect's house, and they're quite distinct from the victim's house. So this was done without any a priori knowledge of what samples were what. And then we've subsequently followed up with linear discriminant analysis, and it basically shows similar things. Now with the linear discriminant analysis, it emphasized the differences more. So again, X-ray diffraction showed the same kinds of things. That the suspect's samples, which are in blue, were in the same range as the suspect's house, whereas the samples from the victim's house were different. So yes, so my conclusion is you guys are actually doing a really good job. And you don't need a lot of these fancy tools, but the fancy tools can be helpful in many cases. So that's it. Thanks.
We do have some time for questions. If anybody has any questions, please step up to the microphone and address the speaker that you do wish to question, and they will kindly answer your question. Going once, twice. Jerry.
I have a question for Bill. I wish I could take this opportunity to say that your presentation made me puke, but I thought it was actually a fascinating presentation. My question in particular was the taco case. You had indicated in there something about a conclusion about a time of death, and I was just wondering, you as a trace examiner, would you draw that conclusion about the time of death, or do you leave that to the medical examiner? Okay, I wasn't sure because the way you had phrased it, you said they probably died after the day after they had the tacos or something. But I was just curious how that might be construed if you're not a medical.
You have to be careful with the conclusions there. That was a conclusion on this particular slide, but not the conclusion in the report that I submitted.
Now, do you work in conjunction with the medical examiner's office and kind of send your report over to the medical examiner for them to use that as interpretation?
No, in that particular case, it was sent to the local authorities, the sheriff's department, I think.
Okay, thanks.
My name is Pat Eddings. I'm from Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Office in Fort Worth, Texas, and I have a question for Dr. Gordon. If you do not do the analysis, the forensic analysis, in an accredited laboratory, it cannot be entered into courts in Texas. Did you have any of those kinds of problems when you began this casework in Arizona, and how did you get around that? Because we love to work closely with some people that are doing extensive research. We have all kinds of people that we want to call on for help, and it's harder now, and we're looking for ways kind of around that.
Yes, I'm not familiar with that legislation. We did have quite a bit of concern about how the results of my analyses might be accepted in court. That we reviewed, so it required reviewing my CV and deciding that I would be able to be accepted as an expert witness in a court case. And we knew that there probably would be, that would be certainly an opening for defense attorneys to say this was not an accredited lab. I did extensive documentation. All of our methods are well established, but we are not ISO accredited. And frankly, our lab is not planning to be ISO accredited. Much of what we do research. So the majority of our analyses are things that there's no regulations about because we're publishing them for the first papers. So that is definitely a concern. I know that there are a number of other academic labs. I have a particular interest also in geolocation, particularly with relationship to isotopes. I know there's some labs up in Alaska, and they've done similar types of things where they have portions of the lab devoted that are very restricted access. And I kept chain of custody reports, and I did all of that. But frankly, it would have been a lot easier if I had been working with kind of professional trace evidence analysts. So I don't know how to address the question about that particular legislation. It was definitely a concern, and that's basically what I can say.
Any other questions? Mr. Randall?
This question is for Ray. I'm Will Randall with the Missouri State Highway Patrol Crime Lab. You had mentioned at the end of your talk that you also did the Bayesian analysis on that case with the flock fibers. I was interested in how you stated that, what were the results of that, and how long does it take to work up that kind of analysis, and what kind of things might you take into account to come up with it?
It's quite a question, actually.
Yeah, we only have 10 minutes.
I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about Bayes' theorem and the workup, and I think a lot of people think about, calculation of likelihood ratios, and it's not all about that. Bayesian approach is more about assessing a case, trying to think of what the cogent issues are, what is it you're trying to address, have you got the materials, the exhibits, the items you need to address a particular question. And it's also formulating in your own mind what the two propositions are, what the prosecution allegations are versus what the defense are. And it's forming what your expectations in a case may be against what you find. And the confusion, I think, lies particularly with judiciary sometimes, is that it's not about calculating a hard statistic, it's about assigning probabilities based upon your own experience and that of the data from the literature. And I think the problem has been in the past where, particularly for trace evidence analysis, is where Bayes has tried to be sold down the route in the same way that DNA has, often by DNA people. And certainly our initiative in the Forensic Science Service regarding fiber analysis has been that we've tried to create, in fact we have created, bespoke training packages purely for fibers regarding the Bayes approach. And we found that people do initially have a degree of resistance with it, but when we actually apply it to particular trace cases, people can see the value in it. Particularly new people coming in embrace it very quickly. I think you find people my sort of age and older around that sort of peer group find it more difficult, are more resistive to it quite naturally. It's a bit of change. I think it's very difficult to answer your question at this point in time. If you want to have a chat with me afterwards, I can go through the process with you. But it's not about producing hard and fast statistics in the same way you would do for DNA. Another thing to be cogent about is that in this particular case, we were working in intelligence, the intelligence mode, rather than evaluative or corroborative much of the time. So there are two different approaches to it. There's very much an evaluative and there's an intelligence approach to it. But if you want to, we can have a chat about this afterwards or go through the process with you, but it's not necessarily about calculating statistic, it's about a particular way of thought and forming your thoughts in a particular order.
To the gentleman from the Netherlands, sorry, your name? The question I had from a law enforcement standpoint, you said you had 5 sledgehammers come back from your story, which I thought that was an excellent story and a great trap that was laid for the suspects. My question is, why wait for 5 more bank robberies? Because from the safety standpoint, you said that they had been weapons involved at different times. Was that carried on to build more evidence or to wait for more suspects to come in? As you said, you had evidence on several.
I'm not familiar with all the aspects of the case, of course, but at that time when we were asked to repaint the hammers, the police wanted to have more information about the individuals who were involved, and apparently they didn't have that information at the moment, and they choose for the instruments to do something with the hammers to get that information. And why they didn't follow other tracks, I don't know.
But from your standpoint, 1 would have been sufficient for your testing?
One hammer was sufficient to identify 1 buyer, but there were several buyers. It was a group of, I think they would consist, the group would consist of about 20-25 people, and the roles they had in that group were one day they did this thing and one day they did another thing. And some people were involved in buying hammers, and by letting the group members sell more hammers, more people could be identified.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chapin.
I'm one of those dinosaurs that's a little resistant to change, but I'm trying. And something you said piqued my interest, Mr. Palmer. You indicated or made a comment that in evaluating the Bayesian approach, you took into consideration, and I'm paraphrasing here, the prosecution and the defense positions. Now, how does that play into the movement toward blind analyses on the analyst part? And are we, as bench analysts, the appropriate people then, if we're doing our analyses blind, to apply the Bayesian thought process?
Well, I think
$5 answer, I'm not sure.
No.
I think there are a number of issues here. If you're in the UK and many other places in Europe, it's the responsibility of the reporting officer to oversee, they won't necessarily be carrying out the analysis themselves, but they'll be taking the results of the analysis and making reports from it. The whole premise of Bayesian approach is not to work blind. Is to have as much information as you can have up front about the case circumstances that are relevant. The thought is, and this is one school of thought, the empiricist school of thought is that you shouldn't have any information at all. My own opinion, and many others who involved in Bayes, is that a blind approach can lead to erroneous conclusions at best and downright wrong at worst. As far as, in order to have a robust, balanced interpretation of your results, it's important that you place these within the context of a particular case. And the circumstances of a case will differ from case to case. So what might be relevant in one case from your results wouldn't be relevant in another. So working blind or in an intellectual vacuum is not something that we would advocate, particularly if you're going to apply Bayes.
Anybody else? Okay. First of all, I'd just like to say on the inside of your booklets, you've got the names of the planning committee. I do hope that you would approach the planning committee members and tell them what you liked and what you didn't like about the symposium. If you want more Bayesian stuff or something like that, please let them know. Secondly, the breakout sessions today are all going to be videotaped. So if you were concerned about you were going to go to the paint one, but there's something in Seoul you wanted to see, after you get back to your labs and it's online, you'll be able to watch those papers. And at 10:30, the breakout sessions are the soil paint and the things that go boom. Please go visit your vendors. Please tip the wait staff. And enjoy the rest of your symposium. Thank you.